Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and our presentation tonight. A few housekeeping notes. May I ask that you turn off your cell phones or any electronic device? Thank you so much for doing that. Also, may I request that you consider filling out a comment card at the conclusion of this talk. We'd love to hear what you think about our programs, our exhibition, about the museum itself. You can deposit it in the box at the back of the auditorium, or you could just take it home with you and just drop it in the mail. No postage is required. Thank you so much for doing that. After tonight's presentation, we'll have a question and answer period. And because this program is webcast, we ask that you present your questions at either of the microphones in the aisles. That will enable our viewers around the world to hear your questions as well as hear Dr. Wolf's responses. Tonight we're here to talk about our wonderful exhibition, The Artistic Journey of Yasuo Kuniyoshi. And our program tonight is very, very special in that the co-curator and one of the leading authorities on Kuniyoshi is speaking tonight. Let me just share a few things about our lecturer tonight. Dr. Tom Wolf is professor of art history at Baird College. He's researched and written extensively on the history of Woodstock, New York, as an art colony. This research led him to study Asian American artists who had a presence in the colony, and there his interest had broadened to a wider examination of Asian American artists in the first half of the 20th century. In addition to co-curating our exhibition, The Artistic Journey of Yasuo Kuniyoshi, and I should mention that the exhibition will be on view through August 30th. And his contribution to the accompanying catalog, Dr. Wolf has curated a number of exhibitions, including Yasuo Kuniyoshi, painter-photographer, Woodstock's art heritage, Yasuo Kuniyoshi's women, Birdcliff, an American arts and crafts colony, and Peggy Bacon, cats and caricatures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Wolf to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The whole picture went off. Okay, that's fine, that's fine. Oh, that's not. Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you, Nona. Thank you for setting all this up, and thank you all for turning out tonight. Let me know if you can't hear me. The title is a title I came up with a while ago, and it's not totally valid anymore, but pretty much an alternate view. I thought the show is there, the catalog is there, and it'd be interesting to expose works by Kuniyoshi that aren't in the show. So that was my original intention. And then I thought probably quite a few of you out there haven't seen the show, haven't read the catalog, so it would be doing kind of a disservice to you. So I'm going to try to do kind of both, present a fair amount of works that are not in the exhibition and not that well known, or that maybe could have been in the exhibition but weren't. And at the same time try to give kind of an overview of his life, career, and art illustrated by works that are in the exhibition. He was born in Japan in 1889 and came to the United States when he was almost 17 years old, but hadn't reached 17 yet, so very young. And he went back to Japan when about 25 years later to see his parents, and that's the only time he went back to Japan. Some of the basic points I think are relevant about Kuniyoshi. In terms of his art, I think it can be divided, it's a little arbitrary, but it can be divided into 3 stages, which kind of parallel the human experience. An early stage, which is kind of youthful and optimistic, and he does a lot of images of children in that early stage, and then a second more worldly, sophisticated stage, and then a late stage which is more preoccupied with ideas of death and disillusionment. One of the main facts about his life that's still relevant today, I think, with all the issues about immigration that are in the news, is that by law, when he came to the United States, he could not become an American citizen. He could not become a citizen in the United States, and his whole life as an artist was here. He became a very esteemed artist, but he could never actually become a citizen, which rankled him because he was very proud of his success here. And he also believed in the American democratic system. And literally, when he was on his deathbed in 1953, the law had recently changed, and he was talking to his lawyer about getting the papers done so he could become an American citizen, but it was too late. And this is a theme, and I'll bring up some examples that runs through his biography, including the fact that in 1948 he had the great honor of being the first living artist to have a one-man retrospective at the Whitney Museum of American Art, but he wasn't an American, so it was kind of ironic. In terms of the alternate view, when we conceived this exhibition, it was basically a team of Elizabeth Brune, Joanne Moser, my co-curator, and myself, and we decided to try and show him at his best and to show a limited amount of works that were really strong. And we also decided to pretty much limit that to just paintings and finished black ink drawings, because I think the black ink drawings are a very significant part of his work. In a statement that he wrote about his aims as an artist, he said his aim was, quote, to combine the rich traditions of the East with my accumulative experiences and viewpoint of the West. And I take that as my kind of job to see how that desire, how that aim manifested itself in his art. And I think one of the ways it did was that he was known as a painter, and he worked in oil paint, which is a technique invented in Europe and developed in Europe and not well known in East Asia. But at the same time, unlike most of his contemporaries, he had a pretty steady practice of doing finished drawings in black ink, which is more of an East Asian tradition, Chinese and Japanese working with water-soluble materials. And he saw those as finished works of art, and sometimes would even do preparatory studies for a finished black ink drawing. And they're fascinating, as you'll see when you see the real ones in the exhibition itself. So right away, to try and define that aim of his, to combine the rich traditions of the East with my accumulative experiences and viewpoint of the West, is kind of built into the exhibition, with the black ink drawings having almost equal presence as the paintings. So this is the painting that leads off the exhibition, his self-portrait as a photographer. It documents the fact that as an art student and sometime thereafter, he supported himself as a photographer of works of art, working for galleries and other artists who wanted their art documented. This is after an early period in the United States on the West Coast of doing menial jobs, picking fruit in the fields and working as a bellboy in hotels, which he continued to do for a while in New York, and then he taught himself photography and started to practice photography. I think it's a really strong image. We use it for the cover of the catalog, and one of my interpretations of it is in an image like this, he's asserting his Japanese-ness. I talk about East Asian elements in his art a lot in the catalog, and I don't have the time to go into it in equal detail, but I will be making some of those points today, how he goes back and forth or also makes kind of unique fusions. The way he emphasizes his Japanese-ness here, I think, and kind of throughout, is through skin color, never pink in any of the figures he paints, but also with the exaggeration of the cheekbones. He makes his face kind of squat, exaggerates the cheekbones, and also the treatment of the eyes. If we look at a photograph of him a few years later, his face isn't shaped like that. So he's stylizing his face and kind of asserting, I think, his identity. This is one of 4 self-portraits he painted during his entire career. And one of the accomplishments of our exhibition is we have all 4 of them on view. This is a very early one from the teens. This is his self-portrait as a golfer, which I write about quite extensively, which I think is another assertion of identity. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, but I think we get the same treatment of the face. And he's playing a sport that was created in Scotland and passed through Europe to the United States. And he's wearing the characteristic garb of a golfer in the 1920s when he painted this. But at the same time, I've suggested that his stance is more like a samurai than in Japanese art, and I could make comparisons than a traditional standing pose from the European tradition. Critics at the time suggested that the color of his vest, which is a characteristic color for him in these years, is a color of traditional Japanese lacquer, this deep orange-brown, which is the case. But also, at this time, he liked to play golf, and he was a really social, gregarious guy, and he played with his artist friends, but he could not join a golf club because he was Japanese, so he went with his friends to play golf. So this is a large painting, and very confrontational in a way, and I see it as a very strong assertion of his identity. And then this is a later painting, 1943, is smaller, more modest, and he looks kind of withdrawn, I think, working on his painting with the model that's kind of his muse behind him. This is painted in the middle of the Second World War, which we'll see was a very difficult time for him, so it's more modest, less confrontational than the one I just showed you. So to get into other aspects of his art, this is one painting that we would have liked to have in the show, but it wasn't available. Child from 1923. It's in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And when they open their new building in Chelsea in the very near future, they want to have this on view, so they wouldn't lend it. But this is one example of his paintings of children in the 20s. And it also shows traces of a variety of traditions that he's arguably drawing on in his art. For one thing, American folk art, which he and his group of artists in these years, when they spent a lot of summers in Algonquin, Maine, were collecting and were early to appreciate. So here's just an Amy Phillips as an example of American folk art that has a similar subject, a boy standing next to a piece of furniture, standing kind of stiffly, that I think, there are many, I'm sure you know many prototypes for this kind of painting. What's typical of Kuniyoshi is the somewhat skewed proportions, the exaggerated head and the small hands. That characterizes this early style of his from the 1920s, which brought him esteem. He started getting more and more shows, and he pretty quickly in the 1920s became a very respected artist in New York. And this is a wonderful painting in the show, Boy Stealing Fruit. It's another image of a child, obviously, or one seems pretty clear that he was identifying with children at this stage, having left his family behind and being fairly solitary in New York. By now, actually, he had quite a few friends at the Art Students League. It's one example of what I think is recurrent in his work, is a subject that few, if any, other artists ever painted. How many paintings are there of boys stealing fruit? And it's funny, it's sly, and he keeps doing that. I'll show you other examples of paintings that are unique in their subject matter. I suspect in the whole history of art. There might be a couple other examples of this somewhere. But also the other thing I really admire about him is he did it once. And he didn't do variations of a boy stealing fruit. There's one painting on that subject, he finished it, and he moved on to other subjects. So as a result, his total production through his career is quite limited. The catalog raisonné that was published of his work a couple decades ago has 350 paintings. It's not a lot of paintings. What's also going on here is the tilted up perspective, the warped perspective of the bowl with the fruit in it that widens out as it goes back in space. So those are conventions that you find in early modernism in Europe, but also conventions that you can find in some examples of Japanese art. And one of the complexities of the kind of analysis I'm trying to do is that the early modernists were themselves inspired by Japanese art. Manet and his circle in Paris were fascinated with Japanese prints that were newly available from Japan, and they directly influenced their work in some regards. So you can't really separate out modernism from the Japanese in many examples. They kind of fuse, and he's drawing on that. This is also a little architectural feature that appears in a lot of his paintings inspired by the landscape in Maine. And this is little Joe with cow, again, a youth. And this is another classic image of his, this cow that is very stylized. It doesn't look like a real cow, especially the face, which is kind of wedge-shaped. It's got a human eye, so it's a peculiar rendering of a cow that was consistent in his work in these years and kind of became his trademark. He said it was because in Japan he was born in a cow year, the year of the cow, so he identified with it. His widow, who I was good friends with, Sarah, his second wife, who I was good friends with, who's now deceased, unfortunately, because she'd be so happy to see this exhibition. She said also cows weren't that prevalent in Japan, so it was kind of an exotic creature to him when he came to the United States. This painting is in the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Arkansas, and it's one of the few paintings that actually has been bought back from Japan, because what happened was in the late 70s and 1980s, when Japan was extremely powerful economically and Kuniyoshi was little thought of here, Japanese collectors were buying up every Kuniyoshi work that came on the market, and also some that didn't come on the market. They actually got several American museums to deaccession Kuniyoshi paintings from their collections because they offered so much money for them. So about a third of our exhibition is actually from Japan, and the other 2/3 is from American collections, mostly museums and a few works from private collections. Another typical Kuniyoshi practice in these years is this, I find, very strange treatment of space, where this is obviously a little leafy plant, but it dwarfs the house, which we understand and is back in the distance, though there's no spatial indication, but it also dwarfs this entire tree. So he creates a kind of magical, dreamlike space in a lot of these works. In terms of the black ink drawings, they were very respected in his time, and with good reason, I think. This is, again, has the cow. This is kind of a combat, I think, again, kind of understatedly humorous between the boy and the cow that doesn't want to go, which is the name of the drawing. The calf doesn't want to go. So there's kind of a tug-of-war going on with this impassive boy in this landscape that kind of floats in space. This is not a realistic landscape with foreground, middle ground, background. Everything just kind of floats in, again, a kind of dreamlike space where this tussle goes on. If you look at this drawing closely, you will see how refined his style is and what beautiful decorative touches he's capable of. The boy's body here, the shirt is white with these very fine black lines. To me, it looks a little like barbed wire with these little knots in it. And then his overalls are black with these fine white lines that Kuniyoshi actually scratched into the ink. And that's a distinctive technique of his that will go through his career doing black and white drawings. Very physical engagement with the paint, often with the ink, often in a very controlled way. If you look at the drawing, it's subtle, but down here, these white highlights are also somehow abraded and actually scratched into the ink itself. This is one that's not in the show that I just picked to illustrate again the strange spatial dissonances in terms of traditional Renaissance-derived realism that he practices, where we have this huge plant in the foreground and then a tiny landscape with a road and an entire house and tree somewhere. I can't exactly call it the background. And this is another type of these wonderful drawings he did, incredibly voluptuous, of still life objects floating on the white field of the paper. At the Art Students League, he studied with Kenneth Hayes Miller, who was immersed in the Renaissance and the Old Masters, and there he learned respect for the Old Masters and Old Master techniques. So I think the extremely volumetric treatment of these prickly pears descends from that, but then the irregular profile of the kind of warped profile of the bowl and the way it floats in space kind of reacts against that. So there are several things going on here. Also, one of the extraordinarily elegant things I think he does in drawings like this is set up these tremendous masses of rounded objects against the surrounding space, and then define the container with just one simple pure line. It's very daring, I think. This is Lady Slipper, and this is an example of these drawings that is in the show. Again, I think extremely voluptuous, and in both of these, he does black ink and then tints just a few of the fruits with ink or with some kind of colored material, and that takes place in the Lady Slipper as well. In terms of his paintings of the 20s, another pretty unusual subject that he takes on is the idea of fear, which is also not a traditional art subject, and which he renders in several, again, one-of-a-kind images. This is in the show. It's called Child Frightened by Water. Doesn't look very frightened, but the title gives that dimension to it. And this lighthouse is one of his recurrent images to indicate the Mayan landscape or to document the Mayan landscape. Also, what I think is distinctive about a lot of these is the brown sky. Not a natural color for the sky, but his color scheme in these years is very distinctive. Lots of warm, muted colors, shades of browns and grays with extreme subtlety. The golfer, self-portrait as a golfer, also had a brown and gray sky. Another thing that's characteristic here is the very small appendages, very bulky limbs and very small appendages, which is somewhat suitable for a baby, but exaggerated here. And this is also in the show. Another one of a kind. This is called Two Sisters Frightened by a Whale. Where did he get that idea? And again, one shot. He did one painting, Two Sisters Frightened by a Whale, moved on to something else. There's the whale in the background. They don't look too frightened, but that's the title. And this is Boy Frightened by Lightning. This is a lost work. And another fact of his career at this point is that quite a few significant and what look like really good early works, we don't know where they are. This is one with the same theme of fear. And this is another. It's an old photograph that documents this painting, so it's yellowed, but this is called Boy Frightened by a Snake. There's the snake, this little curly thing. The boy has climbed the tree. Again, where did he come up with these ideas? You know, it's like a really peculiar thing. Though one context-setting analysis that's been suggested is 1924 was the passage in the United States of the Asian Exclusion Act, where people from Asia could not come into the United States, much less become citizens. They already couldn't become citizens. They couldn't come to the United States. Kuniyoshi had a circle of fellow Japanese artists where he was kind of the leader, but they were all seriously pursuing their work, and they were all in New York, and they all hung out together, and now suddenly nobody else was coming in anymore, and there was a lot of prejudice in these years, so that might be one of the reasons that he turned to this unusual theme of fear in these very personal works. And this is another lost painting. I don't know, I'm just really fond of it. It's called Al Perkins' Drying Fish. You know, it's like, I can't even project what's going on in his mind in these years. It's like probably a Maine subject, and Al Perkins was a fisherman, Maine fisherman, he knew, but still a peculiar subject for a painting, and you can see the up-tilted space that relates to Japanese print traditions and also modernist abstraction. And it introduces another theme that I make a case for was associated with Japan, which is the idea of marine life and sea life, which is so prevalent in Japan culinary culture and artistic culture, which is kind of a hard argument to make because, of course, you get marine life in all kinds of European and American paintings. William Merritt Chase, who Kuniyoshi studied with briefly, did still life paintings of dead fish, but it really appears a lot in Kuniyoshi's work from beginning to end, and I think I kind of set about this task of figuring out what is Japanese in his work because all the critics would review his show and say there's something so oriental about it, there's something so Japanese about it, and they would say the sensitivity, or they'd have some vague term, but I thought there's probably more to it than that can be pinned down. And we'll also see that sometimes he takes on specifically Japanese subjects. Here's another beautiful drawing of a fish, not in the show, where again he creates this really volumetric and beautifully executed image of the object. You can almost see the scales glisten, and then defines its support with just one simple line that gets a little shaded at the top and at the left. And this is a drawing which is typical too. It's got fairly deep space, but it doesn't reach out to the edge on any side, so again kind of floats in space. This is also typical, really tiny signature. This is really relatively big. For a lot of the drawings I've shown you have been signed, but really minuscule. And this is a drawing that documents the fact that after he started getting successful, he and his wife went to Paris in 1925 and had an extended stay in Paris. His wife, by the way, was a fellow artist. His first wife, he was married twice, fellow artist Catherine Schmidt, who he met at the Art Students League, and who not only was ostracized, cut off by her family for 7 years for marrying him, but also had to surrender her citizenship in the United States, because at that time the law was if you were a male citizen in the United States and you married a foreign-born woman, she became an American citizen. But if you were a woman citizen in the United States and you married a foreign-born man, you adopted the citizenship of his native country. This is one of the few records we have of the art he practiced in Paris. Of course, he was traveling a lot and going to museums like crazy, visiting Spain and some other countries as well. But this is an example of his landscape practice at the time, and another painting that we know only through a photograph. And this is a painting, again, that we don't know where it is, but that shows his involvement in the School of Paris. It's a still life painting, and his still life paintings run from being really simple and stark, straightforward, like the beautifully painted painting of two watermelon halves on a table, to being much more complicated and full of suggestive subject matter. This is a bowl of fruit, but what it's sitting on is a famous painting by Matisse, The Woman in a Hat. I don't know if it's there, she's kind of staring out. I don't know if he's being cruel to her by putting her under this still life, or whether it's an homage or both, but it's one of the originary paintings of the Fauve movement, painted in 1905, a radical painting at its own time. And this is actually a painting I really regret not being able to see in color, because with his distinctive color sense in these years, one wonders what he would have done to render the color of this radically flamboyantly colored painting. This is, in terms of color, this is a painting in the show. One thing that happened in Paris was he started circus themes in his art, paralleling a lot of other artists at the time, including Alexander Calder, who also started making his famous circus in Paris in 1925, where he was acquainted with Kuniyoshi. This is called Strong Woman and Child, and we have little Parisian high-rise buildings in the background, kind of homage to Paris. And here, again, these bulky figures of his early years with the small appendages. And here, the French flag, which we all know is red, white, and blue, but when Kuniyoshi paints it, it's gray, white, and brown. He's toning everything down, so it would be so interesting to see what he did with the Matisse, which is not available to us, but the painting Strong Woman with Child is in the show in this museum. This is also in the show in this museum. It's called Weathervane and Objects on a Sofa. Not your run-of-the-mill title, once again. 1933, this is post-Paris now. And I read this as a symbolic still life. It's a big painting, you can see it upstairs, where he's really adopting oil paint in a very personal way. In the 30s, he develops this technique of putting down areas of thick oil paint and then taking a pointed implement or the back of the brush and just kind of scratching through them, so it becomes whirls of tactile texture. And the way I interpret this painting is kind of a creative autobiography. This is a photograph of a Goya portrait that relates both to his earlier experiences photographing works of art as a job, but also to his admiration of the old masters. This is a complicated and again kind of eccentric object. This is a mold for the sculpture of a face. So the sculpture would actually be cast inside that. It's a negative image of a face that was done by a friend of his, a sculptor in Woodstock, New York, which is the art colony 100 miles north of New York City, where he and his first wife bought land and built a house in 1929. So that's where he would be in the summers as part of the Woodstock colony. So I see this as the old masters' contemporary American art. This horse, which is both frozen and seems to be galloping across the space, is a folk art Weathervane. So that's his interest in folk art. And this you can make out, especially if you look at the painting itself. It's a copy of Cahiers d'Art, the main magazine of the School of Paris in these years. So I think he's paying homage to the multiple streams that fed into his artistic identity, except the Japanese, which isn't present here. But I think the eccentric composition on a diagonal and cropped is something that relates to Japanese traditions. Maybe Japanese traditions as they came through the Parisian painters of the late 19th century, but they come from Japanese traditions. He told his students, he talked about Degas, and we have a quote about what he said. He said, Degas learned a great deal from the Orientals. He had an extraordinary sense in constructing. He used big floor spaces, had faces half cut off. And Degas also learned from Japanese prints to compose on the diagonal a lot. And I'll show you an example of a Degas that manifests that in a few minutes. This is the Japanese toy tiger from 1932, not in the exhibition. Would have been a good candidate. He went to Japan in 31, came back with some souvenirs, and this is one of them. So here's an example of him taking a specifically Japanese object and making an important painting of it. This is when his marriage with his first wife, Catherine Schmidt, is starting to fray, and she did her own version of this painting of two Japanese toy tigers in a much more precisely realist style than Kuniyoshi that makes for an interesting comparison that can go in a variety of ways, I think. I don't think there's not one absolute way to interpret a painting, especially if you're talking about psychological and personal issues. Like here, we have the two toy tigers together on one hand. On the other hand, they're not communicating with each other, so you could kind of cut it either way. And here, the toy tiger is clearly looking out at us and confronting us, so there's different dimensions of how these things can be interpreted. But something else that's going on, and this is a theme I'm not going to explore very far, but if you have it in mind, you'll see it in works in the show, is that this is a pair of binoculars, and a lot of Kuniyoshi's images that just look kind of casual have to do with looking, which is the main sense that a visual artist is concerned with. So the binoculars and the tiger looking out, I think, kind of come together in some meaningful way. What we left out of the show is his work as a printmaker. So I'll show you a few examples now. He started making etchings at the Art Students League, which I'm not going to show, and then he did a pretty extensive body of work in lithography over the course of his career. This is his first lithograph, and he printed at the Art Students League. It's, again, that peculiarly shaped cow that was his trademark, kind of floating in space with the milkmaid milking it, and also what I think is another characteristic of a lot of his work and a lot of his sensibility is a kind of down-to-earth concern with bodily functions. I mean, it's drooling at the mouth. Milk is coming out of it into the pail, and it went to the bathroom right back here. So not your normal image of a cow. And then in Paris, that was kind of a one-shot. And then in Paris, he got really involved with making lithographs in something that I think is a great art historical topic, which is there was a print atelier in Paris called Des Joubert where all the Americans went, Stuart Davis, Adolphe Dane, they all made prints there in Paris, and that's where Kuniyoshi learned lithography, which I think he did in a totally non-Japanese way. In fact, when he went to Japan, he wrote Catherine Smith. They don't seem to know about lithography there. and he did it not in a casual experimental way. He really learned the medium and really applied it to themes of proud circus performers. There's another one on a tightrope. Wonderful, especially in person, they're just wonderful shades of dark to light tones and great subtlety in the tonalities. And also kind of sexual women. This is the second phase, when he moves from the childlike to the more worldly, sensual and sexual women, and probably prostitutes as some of his imagery. When these were shown back in New York, the critic in the Herald Tribune said they showed a deplorable lack of taste. And some beautiful still lifes that really manifest that sense of sensitive gradations from dark to light and back again. This is probably the painting that I most regret not putting in the show, and honestly, I just didn't even think about it until I was doing the research from the catalog, and I realized how important it was, but it was too late. But this is his new imagery of kind of voluptuous women. And it's just a really stark and strong painting with her sprawled out on the mattress like that, with her crotch kind of mid-center of the painting, and then other accoutrements like the stove and the umbrella around her, half-dressed women. This is also significant because it was in a very important exhibition called 19 Americans at the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. The Museum of Modern Art started in 1929, and the inaugural exhibition was the Post-Impressionists, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Seurat. Great exhibition, kind of couldn't fail. The second exhibition was 19 Americans, where they took on the very difficult task of selecting 19 contemporary American artists to showcase in the Museum of Modern Art, and Kuniyoshi was one of them. The self-portrait as a golfer was in the show, and so was this painting. And the critical reaction to the show, of course, was diverse, but one consistent theme in a lot of the negative criticism was, why did you call it 19 Americans when you're putting non-Americans in the show? The critics singled out Jules Pascan, who was a good friend of Kuniyoshi's, in New York and in Paris, Lionel Feininger, who was based in Germany, and Kuniyoshi. And Jules Pascan, who was from Eastern Europe but was pretty much at home in Paris during the First World War, had left Paris and come to the United States, and actually had done the work and become an American citizen. So she is actually legally an American citizen. Feininger was based in Germany and affiliated at the Blauer Reiter German Expressionist group, but he was born and raised in Chicago, and he was an American citizen. So Kuniyoshi was really technically the one non-American citizen who was the target of the critics' complaints. In the same show, there were other paintings of reclining nudes by a contemporary of his named Bernard Carfiol, who's not so well known today, but so much more conventional than Kuniyoshi. We don't have that painting in our show upstairs, but we do have this, which I think is kind of a companion, or related to the theme. Again, a half-dressed reclining woman, kind of peculiarly posed. Terrific painting, and typically eccentric, I think. The way that she's sliding out of the painting and half cut off at the lower part and off to one side. And also the strangeness or the exaggeration of her proportions makes for a very unusual image. And here we have a pack of Camel cigarettes, which allies him, which is the case in some of his other paintings, where he puts in circus posters in the background or billboards, allies him with other of his friends and contemporaries who are sometimes seen as New York school ancestors of the pop art of the 60s, aware of advertising culture, aware of commercial imagery in our environment. I'm talking about Stuart Davis, who was a good friend of his, Reginald Marsh, who was a good friend of his, and even from a slightly earlier generation, John Sloan did it sometimes. So this is part of his involvement in American sensibilities. But again, the really strong diagonal composition, so off-center compared to Carfiol, again, his contemporary, who doesn't crop the woman, sits her right up in the middle and has everything very clear and straightforward in terms of traditional representations of the female figure. And then in the later 30s, he starts doing the paintings that, in many circles, he's best known for. These models, partially undressed, sitting in simple interior environments. And here now, well, so the contrast between this from the 20s and this is the handling of the paint, which is now influenced by Paris and is getting really tactile and sensual. And I've interpreted this kind of swirling texture as being maybe a suggestion of an inner psychological turmoil on the part of this passive and maybe slightly depressed woman. About all else that's going on here is the hat, which suggests the absence of a man, and the newspaper. And the newspaper appears in pretty much every one of this group of paintings. This isn't in the show upstairs, but this one is. This is called Daily News, and I think what's going on, well, I know what's going on, is 1933, Hitler comes to power. The Japanese are starting a war with China. The seeds of World War II are being laid, and people are aware of it. And Kuniyoshi and his friends were especially aware of what's going on with Japan. The rise of militarism in Japan, he witnessed when he was there already in 1931, wrote to Catherine Schmidt about it, and he was very unhappy about it. He was a loyal Democrat and a loyal member of the United States, not a citizen, but a member. This is in the show upstairs, beautifully painted, and again, kind of wistful, even sullen, maybe a little depressed, with the newspaper, which I see as the emblem of what's going on in the world. This is another painting we asked for, but didn't get because the museum wanted to have it on view. Lay figure from 37 to 38. As tensions, international tensions are really on the rise. And here he substitutes, for the sensual model, a mannequin with newspapers and some kind of a magazine that says 1906 upside down, which is the year he came to the United States from Japan. So there's a personal element here, and also an element of kind of psychological tension, I think, because she's both a female figure, but she's an inanimate figure, and that's something you find a lot in practice of the surrealists going on in Paris at the same time. Kind of one main inspiration for the surrealists was Giorgio de Chirico. This is the seer from the teens, and this is this idea of something that's human but inhuman at the same time, so it's kind of uncanny, uneasy, or surreal. I just saw some more examples of this in Man Ray's show at the Phillips Gallery, where he also has mannequins playing chess, but they're not people, they're mannequins, so that kind of tension is being explored. This is a photograph by Kuniyoshi of an artist friend of his named Morris Cantor with the mannequin. I'm sorry, my photographs of his photographs, several of them are a little out of focus, but a very debonair looking artist, and then with a somewhat gruesome apparitional figure right next to him. What happened is in the 30s, Kuniyoshi started taking photographs on his own with a lot of his artist friends, which I'm not going to get into in much detail, but they're really good. And they're not in the show, so I thought I'd show you a few of them. Many of them from strange angles and strange perspectives. This is his second wife, Sarah, where he crawled underneath the glass table and posed her and shot her from below, so she kind of hovers in a strange, untraditional space, as does this glass bowl part cut off. These are some photographs he took of a partially ruined shed up in Woodstock, composed on the diagonal. This is the guy example I mentioned to you. As he said, he had an extraordinary sense of constructing. He used big floor spaces and also organized things on an angle instead of on a horizontal vertical axis. And this is unfortunately blurry too, but this is a great Kuniyoshi photograph of Union Square in the snow, which is all diagonals and big empty spaces. These are more straightforward. This photograph, he did one long session of this voluptuous nude model that he photographed in several different poses. This one actually won a photography prize from the Leica Annual, which was one of the main photo publications. in the United States at the time. So it won a prize and was reproduced in the magazine, which is kind of, wow, I've gone through the magazine, you know, it's mostly animals, photographs of animals, sports athletes, and children. And then all of a sudden, this just kind of is kind of a striking contrast to everything else that's going on in there. So that's that sense of sensuality and earthiness that is part of his sensibility being manifest once again. And this is also a little out of focus, but his studio was on Union Square, where there are many demonstrations in these years. And this is a memorable photograph he took, one of a kind, of an anti-fascist demonstration with a grotesque mask of Mussolini, Hitler, and some puppet country confronting a kind of everyman, I think. That's like a premonition of World War II. Kuniyoshi worked actively against Japanese militarism. He did a benefit exhibition of his works for China Relief in New York. And the day after December 7th, 1942, he became an enemy alien. He said, "I haven't changed at all, but my life has changed overnight." He was not put in an internment camp, because the internment camps were on the West Coast, and he was on the East Coast, but his camera was taken away, his bank account was impounded. If he wanted to go from New York to Woodstock, he had to fill out papers and get permission, and he just felt the sting of prejudice and discrimination. But he went to work for the American government propaganda effort against Japanese militarism. He did 2 radio broadcasts for the Voice of America that were broadcast to Japan. And he did this incredible and somewhat uncharacteristic series of drawings against Japanese militarism to be used by the Office of War Information for propaganda purposes, which turned out not to happen. But he made a lot of these drawings, and these are we have 4 of them, 4 very powerful ones in the exhibition. This is one that's in the exhibition, which again brings up a theme relevant today. It's called water torture. He did a series about that. And this is about, well, you can see the water cure. This is a funnel, a bucket of water, and the prisoner's tied up, and water would be forced down his throat until he was near drowning. It's like waterboarding, which has been in the news in recent years quite a bit. This is an especially violent one. Reading the correspondence with the Office of War Information, they actually asked him to make them more extreme. He started by doing drawings of samurai in traditional warrior clothing, and they said, "That's like not really enough. Could you make them a little more intense?" But then he really cut loose with things like this. This isn't in the show, though. And I think it's kind of a catharsis for himself. It's out of character with the other work he did, but it's a tormented time for him, where he's torn between feelings for his native country and feelings against his native country. This is one that I don't think has ever been shown, and I didn't want to put in the exhibition. It's not that great a drawing either, but also I think he wouldn't have wanted it, because it's bombing Japan, and I think at the aftermath of the war, after the atom bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he actually volunteered to go into the U.S. Army so he could go to Japan and help the victims of that bombing, but they said he was too old, so he couldn't go in. So he organized benefit exhibitions to help the Japanese from the internment camps in the United States, and made art to be sold for that benefit. But anyhow, so this is a really extreme one, I think. There's a detail. And the other thing that we kind of gave short shrift to in the exhibition, not entirely, but are his landscape paintings, which is a recurrent practice of his. I showed you the French one that's lost. Here's his more recent style, his style in the later 30s. This is called Abandoned Brickyard. And for once, he does it sometimes, but a rare example of him actually using something like traditional Western perspective, European perspective, going back to a vanishing point. This is a body lying here, a homeless person sleeping under a newspaper. So it's a scene of ruin and dejection, which will characterize a lot of his work from the war years. This is Between Two Worlds, which is again one of these painterly, exquisitely handled landscapes that is in the show. Again, a kind of improbable scene with these kind of skimpily dressed women off to one side, and this brooding building on the horizon, which he said was a sanitarium. This is a landscape of his from 1925 that shows, again, the crispness of his style of the 20s, which becomes much more tactile and painterly in the 30s. And then he turned, during the war years and after, to do some pretty complicated images of kind of heroic single women, of which there are a couple in the show. This is in the show. This is called Somebody Tore My Poster. Very elegant woman, exquisitely poised hands that are such a contrast to those diminutive little hands he was putting on his figures, especially kids in the 20s. I thought I'd show you this because it's one of the many landscapes of ruin with things torn and abandoned and shattered and decaying that he painted in these years. But in this case, it's a specific poster, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to show it to you. It's by his friend Ben Shaw, who's a very good friend of his and allied in a lot of the same left-wing artist causes and anti-fascist causes that Kuniyoshi was. So he took this poster, which is about the French workers surrendering to the Nazi invasion or the Vichy government. He took this poster and represented it torn and fragmented behind this kind of meditative woman turning away from it. And this is his late work is pretty complicated. This isn't in the show. What happens is he moves towards a whole different palette, very bright and even shrill colors, and combines it with cynical or jaded or disillusioned subjects. This is a small painting, but it's called The Widow. So you see her here in black. That's the one black tone in the scene. And then a fragment of a billboard, the vestiges of a circus, and a pretty desolate landscape. This is in the show, and this is again a transition into this new heightened colorism of his post-war work. This is called Disturbing Dream, small painting, one of a kind again, as was The Widow, and I think it's one of the powerful paintings in the last part of the exhibition. I sometimes liken it to a takeoff on the famous Michelangelo motif of God communicating the spark of life with his touch to Adam's finger. Here we have two women acrobats, which we saw in more proud stances in the lithographs and in The Strong Woman of the Child. But this one has lost her grip on her swing, and she's reaching out to her friend to try and rescue her, but their hands do not meet. So it's really like a snapshot of a nightmare, rendered in paradoxically pleasant colors. He said of the color in his late works, the grimness of reality is heightened by the color of unreality. And that's a quote from the little exhibition of his documents from the Archives of American Art that is, coincides with our exhibition in the portrait gallery. They curated, they have a room where they curated a show of Kuniyoshi photographs and documents. This is another virtuoso drawing called Murdered. I think he did ruler-drawn lines at the top, and then this kind of chaos of garbage and this brutalized woman juxtaposed with the delicate plants in the foreground. And this is a show in the painting in the late part of the show of two dogs, which just looks kind of mean and haunted, I guess, because this one is snarling, and this one seems to be cowering and running away. This is 1945, but through my research and just looking at Kuniyoshi's work, I saw that he did another version of that ink drawing called Murdered, which is this, where the woman is accompanied by the two dogs, 1944, and then he altered it by doing a painting with just the two dogs and removed the woman in 1945. This is another work. If I had one more work to borrow for the show, it would be that Reclining Woman, and then it would be this, an intense little painting called Little Girl, Run for Your Life, where you see the girl in the middle ground and then these fighting, kind of monstrous fighting insects in the foreground. And this is, I guess, the poster piece for the show. And this is upstairs, and it shows his eruption into intense color in his late works. This is the Fish Kite from 1950. He died partway through 1953 from stomach cancer that took a long time to be diagnosed, so he was suffering at the end of his life. I don't know if it's this early, but this is another example of him taking a specifically Japanese subject to kind of declare identity. It's the Boys' Day annual ceremony in Japan, where on that day they fly fish kites from poles in front of their houses. So that's what he's representing here in these bright festive colors. But if you look at it, this boy seems very withdrawn, and this girl is almost scowling. So there's a dissonant note in terms of the psychological representation of the human protagonist in this painting. And this is another late one that's upstairs, Forbidden Fruit from 1950, which is, I think, a reconsideration of the boy stealing fruit, much shriller in color. And now it's not a boy stealing fruit successfully, now it's forbidden fruit, and this kind of pallid-looking, big-headed youth is looking longingly at the fruit that he can't reach. So it's a rephrasing and well, like you said, the grimness of reality is heightened by the color of unreality. In terms of the color, what strikes me about it is this progression of the two oranges and this deep orange or red with underneath colors coming through, which to me suggests a lot Mark Rothko, like whose paintings I saw, comparable color paintings at the Phillips collection yesterday. What's happening, one thing that's happening here is the abstract expressionists are surging, and Kuniyoshi and his generation are suddenly old guard. And that was disillusioning to him. He was not in favor of abstract art, and he was well aware that they were taking over. So that was another aspect of his disillusion in his late years, his career ended with a series of highly worked, highly finished Sumi ink drawings. He returned to the ink of his native country and did less than 20 of these. Like I say, highly worked preliminary sketches, highly finished. This is one that's not in the show, so I thought I'd show it to you. Of a kind of mad clown. I think he's getting interested in abstraction because this is a pretty complicated and lively abstract passage of hard-edged geometry up here. But then we have the theme of the mask, which is recurrent in his late work, an image of duplicity or of not knowing people who present themselves genuinely. And I think as important as this, which is like a 19th century military officer's hat. I think that this is still anti-militarism, as if the people who run the army have gone mad and have this strange kind of mentally disturbed physiognomy. And this is now after the atomic bombs, when there's great consciousness of the potential of atomic destruction worldwide. Anyhow, that's not in the show. This is in the show, Work at Dawn, again, heavily worked. The insects now, the ant carrying the dead praying mantis across this desolate landscape. And this is not in the show. I don't think it's ever been shown, actually. It's a small, late drawing called Woman and Child, disturbing and brutal, where this is the child. She seems to be holding a knife and kind of holding the child aloft. I thought I'd show it because I do have, these are very hard to reproduce because they're so dark and often under glass. But I've got a good detail of it that shows you how worked the surfaces are. It's kind of a sad aftermath to the more proud and psychologically linked strong woman and child. There's a detail, and relates a lot, I think, again, to the abstract expressionists. As you probably know, most of them had a phase of their career where they did only black and white works, and they were very concerned with texture and tactility. So here, still using representation, Kuniyoshi is kind of paralleling some of the practices of the younger generation. And this is the culminating drawing of the show, this magnificent drawing called Old Tree. Again, heavily worked. If you look at it, layers of black torn into and repainted. And I see this as a psychological self-portrait at the end of his career. It's complicated, it's dense, it's scarred, it's weathered, but there's also a beautiful sense of some light seeping through from the landscape behind. So that concludes my remarks about Kuniyoshi's career. Right on time, I think. And if you have questions, and I can see you, I can kind of see you with this light shining on me, I'll try and answer them. Or we can all go have dinner. Yes.
What was his relationship with Jules Pascal, and how do you think that his art relates to Pascal?
Oh, I think Pascal is probably the one artist who had a really noticeable influence on him. Pascal was known for his kind of sensual and erotic paintings of female models, half undressed, all undressed, and he also was a huge playboy, you know, made a lot of money and would famously take gangs of people out to drink and party until late at night. He lived a decadent lifestyle, and he was really good friends with Kuniyoshi. And I think that's one of the things that spurred the breakup of his marriage, actually, because Pascal wanted Kuniyoshi to stay in Paris, and Catherine Schmidt wanted to go back to the United States. And she actually went back to the United States, left Kuniyoshi in Paris, and then he came back later. And then a couple of years later, Pascal kind of brutally committed suicide, which was pretty upsetting to Kuniyoshi. But what's interesting about Pascal's suicide is he left his estate to his wife and to his mistress, who co-administered it from that time on. Yes?
You mentioned he came to the United States in 1906, and he presumably came through San Francisco, and that's when the earthquake destroyed San Francisco. Do you know the timing of that?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, he went to Seattle, and from Seattle to Los Angeles. So I don't think he spent much time. Maybe that's why he didn't go to San Francisco. I don't know the exact months. I never really thought about that. But he had a little time working in Seattle, and then he went to Los Angeles, and he went to high school, even though he was old by American standards. And he did an art project where the teacher said, "This is really good. You should become an artist." And that's the first thing that got him thinking about becoming an artist, or one of the first things that got him. I should say, in Japan, he went to a textile design school, so he did have some background in Japanese arts and crafts before he came to the United States. Yes?
So when he came to the United States, did he come with his family?
Oh no, he came alone.
He came alone, and was that a common thing for a Japanese teenager to move to America? It seems sort of unusual.
Well, somewhat unusual, somewhat unusual. I mean, what's happened to me as a result of this study is that I've become much more involved with Asian American art history on the whole, which is kind of a growing field. And his friends had similar histories, though often they would have a parent who was here, father who came here already, and then they would follow. Kuniyoshi is one of the rare ones who just came alone. And there was a common misconception that you come to the United States and you get rich, you know, but they really believed it, I think. Or you come to the United States, make a lot of money, and then go back to Japan and are a big deal. Didn't work so easily. Yes? A little bit, but not much. Hardly. And that was also his plan, to learn English. He wrote a little, there's a little book in a series published by the Associated American Artists from like 48, I think, that you can get online pretty cheap, which is his major autobiographical statement. He said he had no intention of becoming an artist. He thought he would learn to speak English and translate English and make a lot of money and go back to Japan. Yes?
Can you speak to the image in a lot of paintings of social media? There's always a bare tree in a lot of these paintings. And, you know, even when we look at here, off to the side, there's a bare tree.
Yes.
Can you talk to that?
Well, it's something that Elizabeth Brun, the director of this institution, and I disagree about a little bit, because she thinks it's kind of a death image, and I think it's a young sapling that goes along with the kind of optimism of his early works. And I actually found one that has little leaves, so I would interpret this as kind of a comment on those sprightly early trees, though she wouldn't necessarily agree. Yes?
Where did he get his books of his time? Maybe after the States?
Mostly in New York. I mean, he came and went to a bunch of different art schools in New York, and finally found himself at a place where he felt at home at the Art Students League, where he met a bunch of friends like Reginald Marsh and Alexander Brooke and Peggy Bacon and Catherine Schmidt, who he would marry, among others. And then he became a teacher at the Art Students League, so his career is pretty connected with the Art Students League. Oh, right. Morris Cantor, right? His father studied with Morris Cantor, he told me, so I said I had a surprise for him. All right, well, Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the show.